Hello and welcome. The real reason Russia has not collapsed and why Western analysts keep getting it wrong. That is today's topic. In March 2022, just weeks after the invasion of Ukraine, a senior economist speaking to Western media said something extraordinary. Russia's economy, he predicted, would collapse within 6 months. Factories would shut down, the currency would crash. The state would run out of money to fight the war. That prediction was repeated across the television studios and policy briefings from Washington to London. Let's pause for a moment. It has been more than 2 years since the war began, and it's in its third year, and Russia's economy has not collapsed. So the real question is not political here. The real question is quite analytical. How did so many serious institutions and analysts get this so wrong? I am Dr. Adeel. I have spent years studying conflict, energy politics, and the hidden economic forces that shape global power. And today, we are going to unpack one of the most misunderstood economic stories of the war in Ukraine. You are watching In Focus with Dr. Adeel. So let's get back to our topic. When sanctions hit Russia in 2022, the expectation across much of the Western policy world was simple. Economic pressure would break the Russian system. That was the expectation. Banks were cut off from the global financial network. Hundreds of Western companies left the Russian market. And the Russian central bank reserve abroad were frozen. So many analysts and journalists predicted a dramatic contraction. In fact, early forecasts from institutions like the IMF expected Russia's economy to shrink significantly in 2022. And it did shrink that year. But something unexpected happened afterward. Instead of collapsing, Russia's economy stabilized and even returned to modest growth in later forecasts. Inflation spiked at first, but the Russian central bank stabilized the currency. The ruble did not disappear. The banking system did not implode. So the gap between prediction and reality became too large to ignore. Which brings us to the first big question. And the question is, how exactly did Russia adapt? The first adaptation was trade rerouting, in fact. When Western markets closed, Russia redirected large portion of its exports to countries that did not join sanctions. Energy shipments increased towards China and India. Turkey and the United Arab Emirates became important trade corridors. Oil that once went to Europe started traveling to markets instead. Then there was the so-called shadow fleet, hundreds of tankers operating through complex ownership. Structures began moving Russian oil outside traditional Western shipping systems. This allowed Russia to keep exporting energy even under the G7 price cap. Energy revenue fell compared with pre war peaks, but it did not disappear, and energy exports remain the backbone of the Russian economy. But energy alone does not explain the resilience. The second factor is something Western economic models often underestimate, and that is the role of the state. Russia did something that democracies rarely do easily. It recognized its economy around wartime production. Defense factories expanded production, industrial plants shifted towards military contracts. Government spending surged to support the defense sector. Think of it as a partial wartime mobilization of the economy. Not unlike what major powers did during the Second World War, this kind of system is insufficient. It often distorts the economy, but it can sustain production and employment during a conflict. At the same time, Russia pushed policies of import substitutions. Some sectors succeeded, others struggled badly without Western technology. But the overall effect was stabilization rather than collapse. Still, even these adaptations don't fully explain why the regional predictions failed, because the deeper issue was not the data, it was the model used to interpret the data. So that was the main thing. Here is the critical mistake most Western economic models assume. Governments behave like market economies focused on growth and consumer welfare. Russia does not operate that way. Russia operates in a different way. The Kremlin's primary objective is regime stability. That means maintaining state revenue, maintaining security forces, and maintaining the political system. Western models often assume governments will avoid imposing heavy costs on their own population. Authoritarian systems sometimes make the opposite calculation. They accept economic pain if it preserves political control. And that difference in incentives matters enormously when sanctions are used as a strategic weapon. It means the economic pain required to force political change can be much higher than analysts expect, which leads to the final lesson. Sanctions are powerful tools. They isolate economies, they restrict technology access, they increase the cost of conflict. But history shows they rarely collapse governments by themselves. From Cuba to Iran to North Korea, economic pressure often produces adaptation instead of surrender. Take the example of Iran. The Russian case reinforces that pattern. Sanctions changed the structure of Russian economy, but they did not produce the rapid collapse many predicted. And that tells us something important: how economic warfare actually works. Here is the uncomfortable conclusion: Russia's economy has not collapsed, it has adapted. Not efficiently, not without serious long term damage, but it has adapted enough to sustain the state during wartime. Sanctions still matter. They have reduced access to Western technology and investments. They have increased the cost of war as well, but the original collapse scenario that dominated Western discussions early 2022 did not happen. And understanding why it did not happen is critical if economic sanctions remain a major tool of global strategy. If there is only one takeaway from this story, it is this: economic pressure can weaken a system, but it rarely destroys it as quickly as policymakers hope. If this analysis changed the way you look at the headlines this week, subscribe to the channel and keep on watching this channel. Thank you very much. You are watching In Focus with Dr. Adeel.